Kwe, hello. Greetings here from my homelands, ancestral homelands, Mi'kma'ki, otherwise known as Nova Scotia, Canada. I'm a Mi'kmaq woman from a small community in Nova Scotia known as Bear River First Nation. I am currently also an assistant professor in the faculties of law and management at Dalhousie University. I've also worked, though, quite extensively in the past 20 years with Indigenous communities and in different formats, nationally and internationally. And so I'm quite honored to be here today and to facilitate this particular panel on creating sustainable livelihoods. We're going to be looking at sustainable livelihoods, discussing how our experiences with trying to create sustainable livelihoods as it creates to oceans. I also just want to take a moment to honor all of the ancestral homelands and oceans of Indigenous people here and around the world. And so it's quite an honor as an Indigenous person to be able to do that. And that's custom of how we try to acknowledge the ancestral homelands and oceans and waterways that we are so intricately connected with. And so with that, I'm going to have the panelists introduce themselves. I'm quite honored. I know two of them. And we're going to begin with Mitchell Lay. And Mitchell, if you want to introduce yourself, can you introduce yourself, briefly explain how the theme relates to the work that you are involved with?
Yes, good day to everyone, and echo Sherry's sentiments. Happy Oceans Day, and I'm happy to be here with you. I'm Mitchell Lay from Antigua and Barbuda. I'm a small-scale fisherman, but I'm also involved significantly in fisherfolk organizations, in as much as we seek to promote participation in fisheries governance and to protect and promote the interest of the small-scale fishing communities. I've been fishing for in excess of 30 years, and I've also been deeply involved in fisher organizations from the mid-90s, 1990s, starting initially at the local national level and then progressing to the regional level, and eventually I've actually made it to the global level as well in regards to representing fisherfolk and our interest. We find increasingly in this season that we certainly have a lot more work to do, and some of the challenges are really significant, particularly the issue of communications and getting time to participate, for our livelihoods depend on us. So those are some significant challenges that we do face that we seek to overcome as well. But that's a little bit. I look forward to the discussions, and once again, I'm happy to be here with you today. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you, Mitchell. And Hannah. Hannah's no stranger as well. I've worked with Hannah before at an international level, and so it's quite an honor to be here and see you, Hannah. So Hannah, you want to take a few moments to introduce yourself and the work you do and how it relates to today's theme of creating sustainable livelihoods with the oceans?
Aloha, Sherry. Aloha mai kako. Aloha to us all. I'm going to take a little bit of time to give us background, because so often when we think of Hawaii, we think of a resort destination. But I am Hannah Kihalani Springer. I am a native Hawaiian. I live in the same Ahupua'a, which is a traditional subdivision of land that my ancestors lived in at the time of Captain Cook's arrival to Hawaii in 1778. Through the generations, we have not moved more than 10 miles away from our home base. We may leave for occupational or educational pursuits, but we always return home. We're born here and we come home finally. This is important because we have been stable on this land, seeing island chiefs rise and fall, an island nation born and die before its time. We've seen political parties wax and wane, elected and appointed officials come and go, but we remain. We remain because we know and love our land like we know and love no others. And our prayer is that all of us will come to know and love their lands and the seas of them in that same way. We remain because we know how to live within our means upon our homelands in contentment and with satisfaction. We remain because we aloha keakua, God, we aloha aina, the land, and we aloha ike kahi, from one to the other. We know that our marine and terrestrial resources and biodiversity are bound sweetly by the waters that fall from heaven and percolate through the forest and travel in subterranean streams to feed the ground-dependent fish ponds, estuaries, and the fisheries beyond that. We are all part of the cash economy, but healthy, nearshore waters and fisheries allow us the freedom from store-bought processed foods. We hui up. These are our strategies. We hui up, gather in local family networks, regional networks of family networks, and globally in networks of networks. Every chance that we have to aloha ike kahi, and to share the histories and techniques and hopes, every chance we get. And that's why I'm here today. Aloha nui kākou. Thank you, Sherry.
Dr. Carl Carter, if you could take a few moments to introduce yourself and the work that you do in relation to today's topic.
Great, thanks, Sherry. Well, it's lovely to hear those introductions from the other speakers. I should say Shemai. I'm in Wales at the moment. My name's Carl Cater. I'm a tourism academic, really. My first kind of encounters, I suppose, with livelihoods and marine conservation was with a wonderful organisation that operated out of the UK called Coral Key Conservation back in the 1990s. And we used to, they used to run great operations going out to provide baseline surveys in some of the beautiful coral reefs around the world. And that sort of ignited my sort of passion for marine conservation, but also then the opportunities, I guess, that tourism as one livelihood offers the communities, host communities around the world. So really since then I've been working in Australia and the UK and various destinations to develop tourism and researching in the area, and that I guess culminated in last decade, about 10 years ago, publishing this book, Marine Ecotourism, and it's nice to hear this discussion about intergenerational understandings, because I actually worked on that project with my mum, who's also similarly passionate about the kind of issues and the opportunities that marine ecotourism can offer livelihoods to coastal destinations. So and the subtitle of that book, we called it Marine Ecotourism, but the subtitle was Between the Devil and the Deep Blue Sea, because I think what we often find in coastal communities that develop ecotourism is, there are wonderful opportunities that come out of it, but there's also many cases where there can be negative impacts, and we quite often find this real balancing act, and I'm sure that some of that discussion will come up today.
Thank you, Carl. So I'm going to begin with a few questions, and hopefully we'll all have the opportunity to answer them. And I do know of some of the work with small-scale fisheries, as Mitch well knows, that we struggled for 7 years, I believe, to achieve the international guidelines on small-scale fisheries from the small-scale fisheries perspective. And of course, I've worked with Hannah and those challenges in terms of how do we not just integrate Indigenous knowledge, but how do we acknowledge that knowledge in a transformative way as opposed to just integrating it. And so these are some of the challenges that I know that we have faced, and particularly with our oceans and waterways. And so the first question is, like, what are some of the challenges? What are some of the challenges do you feel in your work as it pertains to your work for achieving sustainable livelihoods? Maybe we could go ahead, Hannah.
I need to speak out regarding over-tourism. During the time that we were in rest because of the COVID, the nearshore fisheries that people use to supplement their store-bought food experienced a remarkable benefit from that rest. The fish were coming in closer to the resource fish were coming in closer to shore than they usually do. People were able to find parking spaces at their favorite fishing locations. So mine is just a cautionary tale. In Hawaii, we don't have a seasonal break from the onslaught of people that you might in the more northern latitudes. Thank you.
Yes, Sherry, can I jump in here?
Sure.
So I see quite a few significant challenges to sustainable livelihoods in the context of small-scale fisheries. So I'm looking from my lens at the moment. And of course, we represent a significant percentage of the livelihoods that depend on the ocean. And I would say 90% or more of the livelihoods that are ocean-based are found in the small-scale fishery sector.
Just to go back to what Hannah was saying, obviously one of the big issues is you know, something like tourism quite often is quite blinkered, and it kind of sits in this like silo. It doesn't really understand the impacts that it's kind of having on the host destinations and the communities that are hosting. And obviously when we're looking in livelihood terms, we're thinking across the whole spectrum really of opportunities to earn a living really from all the resources that are there. So I think tourism has to be much more respectful of the other you know, economic practices and livelihoods that are happening, just as, you know, this obviously the attention to the fisheries and the communities that are already there.
In Hawaii, the small scale fisheries that we're talking about have declined drastically. So much of my experience with fishing is more of a subsistence work, again, to supplement our store-bought foods. Yeah.
And you could raise another interesting point is about, you know, consumption as well, because I think, you know, it's sometimes you know, the ecotourism, there's this sort of like idea that there's too much focus sometimes on purely non-consumptive forms of tourism. And of course, indigenous practices, you know, have all been about living with the land and off the land for as long as we've been around. So that's another interesting point.
Thank you so much for that. And I see that Mitch has rejoined us. And Mitch, you were about to tell us what some of the challenges are. Well, you had many, but you're going to focus in on a few with achieving sustainable livelihoods with the oceans.
Yes, so I was referring to the context of the small-scale fishery sector and the fact that we do comprise by far the largest percentage of livelihoods in the ocean space. But we see increasing challenges, particularly from the new blue economy focus, which seeks to sort of sideline the small-scale fishery sector. We do see as well significant challenges in the narrative at the global level, and the narrative that speaks to fisheries in the context of say, control and disease, conservation type narrative that purely seeks to look at negative aspects as opposed to promoting some forms of development we appropriate, and also to look at how statistics are interpreted. And a lot of times the global interpretation is forced in the local context, and this presents a serious challenge for local economies to actually generate and sustain livelihoods in the sector. These are just a few. We do have some more, but I'll give some opportunity for the others as well.
Yeah. Hannah?
I was just going to say, locally, a small-scale fishery that developed and is now being grappled with was aquarium fish collection, where you had folks going out to catch the pretty fish. But some of the pretty fish were also food resource fish. So there was some tension there, and we're grappling with it in both the courts and legislatively in Hawaii. Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you so much for all of those. And I just want to follow up a little bit before we go on to our next question with what Mitch was saying. This really holds true for Indigenous peoples as well, and small-scale fisheries. We always seem to be stuck in between. Well, first of all, just trying to gain access to a livelihood with all these other livelihoods. But I know from in the Canadian context, it always seems that there's two choices. It's either this over exploitation, like you have to grow your technology to this mega development, or this development model where you're almost forced to over exploit the resources, to that conservation on the other end of the spectrum where there's no human footprint, or what they call fortress conservation. And as Indigenous people, and I can say this for small scale fishers as well, we're trying to perform a livelihood in good relationships with the ocean, the good as our relatives, as not taking more than what we need, or we're trying to make a livelihood without compromising the ecological systems that support that livelihood. And that's what makes it so challenging. So with that, I'm going to follow up with a question. So you just mentioned your challenges. What would be the ideal concept of a good, sustainable livelihood? What would be, like, say, if what would be the ideal, like here, we're saying the state of sustainable livelihoods. What would that encompass? And what techniques, or what would we have to do to get there?
At home, we are involved in a 10-year all species rest from the shoreline, so including the shellfish and the seaweeds, out to a depth of 120 feet, which is about the extent of a free diver or a family on a small boat. We got tremendous pushback on that, but we're exercising the traditional and customary right to rest a resource. In our legislation and legal system, the emphasis has been on extracting resources, hunting rights, fishing rights, but we're choosing to exercise the right to rest as a traditional and customary practice. So when we can approach our seascapes with that sense of rest is an important part of any life cycle, and treat our family of the reef in that same way, we're 5 years in, and the statistical results are astounding. Thank you.
Thank you, Hannah. If I may just quickly follow up, has everyone bought into that? Is that a whole shoreline, or is that just your people? Or
it's about a 3-mile stretch of shoreline on our home, Ahupua'a, and there are skeptics, but if I can tell a little story, and of course some pushback, but we requested and received state permission on a special use permit to hold an invasive species roundup, removal from the reef. And so some of the skeptics came to check us out and see how it truly was. Well, when they went into the water, they had to step over shellfish and limu that they had not seen in such abundance in their young lifetimes. And when they got into the water, they saw the lobsters and other resource species in a relative abundance. I heard from the streets when they got home, they were saying, "Uncle, that must have looked like old Hawaii. We want to do that too. Can we?" So that leading by example, if we are diligent and clear with our intention and have aloha, we can make headway even among the skeptics. And then there are the anti-regulatory types that are just going to be against sorts of measures anyway. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Right. it's having those really strong links to place and strong involvement from the community. I think the things that you're talking about, Hannah, is what makes a difference, doesn't it? And I think, you know, sometimes we think maybe there's been a change, maybe a bit in attitudes, that, you know, rather than that top-down management approach of the old MPAs, you know, moving towards much more kind of locally managed marine areas. You know, I've seen wonderful examples of these in New Guinea, for example, where the community is involved. And we've seen time and time again, you know, these examples of no-take zones having an enormous impact, not just on the zone itself, but also on the surrounding ecosystem as well. And having those long time scales as well, I think that you're talking about, which is always the challenge when it comes to politics, because politicians are in for the short game, you know, but we're talking about, you know, time scales that go on, you know, for millennia. So we need to be able to engage with that, and also to be able to adapt to change as well. And, you know, we know that there's a lot of change happening in our oceans, and being able to have communities and places that can adapt, I think, is key.
Mitch? Is Mitch frozen, or is he thinking? I think poor Mitch is frozen again, so we'll just carry on and hopefully he'll come back. So go ahead, Hannah.
One of the elements of our conservation action plan includes restoring the ono. The ono in Hawaiian is the flavor. What we found over time is that many of the young people have lost the taste for the nearshore reef fish. Even in Hawaii, when you talk about having fish for dinner, you might be talking about a commercially caught pelagic species. But we look forward to sharing the same flavors that our ancestors had with the children that are coming after us. Thanks.
So Mitch?
Yes, if I were to say, let us look at a type.
Oh, unfortunately, I think Mitch's connection is bad, and hopefully we'll get him back.
I'd love to know what he thinks about the different flavors of fish. He must be an expert.
and we'll pick up with that. I think, Hannah, you know, I know we have only so much time, but I think Hannah's already touched on this, you know, as what is a good strategy. And even Carl, you focused on the, you know, the intergenerational nature of being able to have access, which is just so important for, you know, indigenous people, but particularly for humanity and for those species, to ensure that they're there for future generations. And Hannah, you spoke to a strategy, because I was going to ask you about strategies, and to be able to, even in that small space with just your own people, to be brave enough and say, you know what, we have to shut this down. And I'm quite sure all our water relatives knew where the safe place was to go, and that's why you have this abundance of fishes and so forth. And I think that's just so brave, and being able to, you know, that's how I was raised, that you don't over exploit. And, you know, if it gets to a dangerous things, well, what are we going to do best? So I've heard that strategy, and I see Mitch moving, so I know he's not frozen. And so, Mitch, if you want to jump in on this.
Yeah, I wanted to make a contribution in terms of how do we look at having sustainable livelihoods and creating those in the small scale fishery sector, in the ocean space, with other competing actors as well. So one of the key points for me would be for new actors to respect existing actors. So have a respect for the actors that are already there. We're already in this space. So you don't ride roughshod over the existing actors. And this seems to be an emerging issue. Yes. And then the other issue is the issue of the responsible stewardship on the onus on the fishers themselves. So in the Caribbean Network of Fisherfolk Organization has created a code of conduct for fisheries and the fisherfolk themselves, with some collaboration with our partners, so that we can be responsible stewards to secure the ecological foundation of our livelihoods, so that those livelihoods.
Yeah, Mitch is frozen again, but I really appreciate the essence of what he's saying. And this has been so difficult because there is this notion of ocean grabbing as there is land grabbing. And I just wanted to offer something here. I spoke with Elder Dr. Albert Marshall, who's well known in Mi'kma'ki for his concept of two-eyed seeing, of trying to bring the best of worlds together and so forth. And he's big on having inherent responsibilities. That's really, and Hannah can relate to this, that's really ingrained in our language, and that we have these responsibilities not to compromise the integrity of the ecosystems that provide us with these gifts. And I think that's just really so important. And when I was speaking with him last, I was about to talk about in regards to in another format on oceans, and he says, you know, Sherry, that's so important. He said that's our last source of survival. And I said, well, Elder Albert, what makes you think that the oceans is our last source of survival? And he said, because he said our forests are all but near destroyed. And I've been thinking about that and thinking about this, and particularly in this era of the blue economy. And we've known about this for some time, this blue economy, but it's being portrayed as being the last frontier for economic development. And for us, we're thinking about, well, we've been struggling to have access to compete with these huge mega destructive technologies, and how can you economize what's left of the ocean, and who is that going to displace? So it's a little bit of fear there. So I want to turn things around because we only have a few moments left, and I want to turn things around here. So, you know, and Hannah sort of hinted at these and so forth, but I have a couple of questions here. What extent do you think your efforts can serve as an example for other communities regionally and globally? Hannah?
Thanks. When it's time to go to the beach, we go to the beach. When it's time to go to court, we go to court. There was an Army Corps, a United States, a federal Army Corps of Engineers permit for near shore modification that we were able to weigh in on. For the first time, we argued that a certain fish hole, a certain seaweed bed, and certain shellfish nests had to be analyzed using National Historic Preservation Act criteria, in addition to being assessed for their biological presence and condition. This was a first. It turned out that these biological communities did not rise to being protected by the National Historic Preservation Act, but the precedent was made that the act could be used to assess biology. So it added another tool to our kit. We're always looking for ways to enhance the relationship that we have with our family in the sea. And again, go to the beach, go to the court, go to the halls of the legislature, do it at the county, state, and federal level, and among friends. Aloha ike kahi. Thanks.
And Carl, you work with tourism. What would be your example that you think that could be carried regionally and globally?
Well, I think that's fascinating that you've hit on this, you know, because it keeps coming up, this intersection between the global and the local. You know, we're talking about, you know, communities that are working at obviously a very local level, but they're in a space where you know, global trends and things are just working all the time, and sometimes can be used actually for positive outcomes. So it's kind of getting that balance between the two. And I think, you know, what's clear, I suppose, in my work is, you know, is getting partnerships is the key, and those partnerships that work across scales, and that's not easy. It's something that often only happens over long periods of time. But it was wonderful in the introduction hearing that we're an international family here, I suppose, working in this space, and that we can share, I suppose, our experiences and examples of what works locally, and see whether there's lessons that can be applied internationally. And I suppose one of the biggest things that I've used again and again is making sure that communities are kind of aware in a livelihood sense of the assets that they've actually got. So hearing some of those stories about the different species and wildlife that Hannah has identified, well, that really is identifying the assets that a community has. So using things like the sustainable livelihoods approach, which breaks it down really, at a minutiae level to see what a community has and how it can protect those assets, but also use things like tourism and other industries then to enhance and augment those assets. So we're actually improving our communities and our places and our ecosystems in which we're based.
Thank you so much for that. And I was going to pass it on to Mitch, but I don't think he's with us.
I'm here, Sherry.
Are you here? Are you here, Mitch? Okay. Well, Mitch, when you were talking about, some of the, or what an ideal sustainability or sustainable livelihoods would look at, and you were talking about the dispossession or the lack of respect for the users that are already there. And I had summed up with ocean grabbing and this big challenge of working with the blue economy and so forth from a small scale perspective. And so I tried to reiterate where I think you were going with that. And but what we're talking about right now is how do you think, or to what extent do you think that some of the efforts that you're working on could serve as an example for regionally and globally?
So I think some of the things that are really critical to move to different levels and to share as well include the whole issue of building capacity for informed participation in governance. So building the capacity for informed participation by fisherfolk in fisheries governance. I think that is a critical component. The other area that we work on significantly is the area of communications, where we try to get information to fisherfolk, both management information, responsible practices information, and building knowledge, particularly in the areas of policy, governance, etc. And the other area is actually participating. So building the actual space so that you have fisherfolk representatives who have the time to participate. I think that's critically important, because you know the work that you're in and you know what is required to keep it. So you need to be active in that space. So not only building the capacity to participate, but also creating the environment so that people can actively participate. So we actively participate in the regional fisheries governance mechanisms in the region, and we promote the national organizations, promote their participation at the national level as well. So those are some of the things that we focus on. And I would say that the whole idea of having capacity to look at how we behave responsibly in the environment as well is an important factor. So those are some of my thoughts, Sherry. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much. I think all of you spoke quite well to the importance of community involvement. And unfortunately, a lot of decisions are made from a very top-down perspective that does not take into consideration the people who are striving to make a sustainable livelihood. And I think, Carl, you talked about the importance of community assets, and Hannah, the importance of her community getting together and making that very courageous decision to you know, to just let the fish rest for 10 years. And Mitch, in talking about community involvement, community representation, and particularly in the governance. And I think this is just so near and dear to my heart. It's about, you know, my work is about creating spaces of the voices that are missing a lot of times, and they're really key knowledge holders that can really guide us to more sustainable livelihoods. With that, I just want some closing remarks. We'll have some closing remarks, and this is a real challenge, and even for me. But what is something that you're optimistic about? Or what would be your takeaway message that you would like to give the audience, that the audience to leave with?
So before I pop out, I'll go first, Sherry.
Okay.
I think for me, I would look at the next generation and say to the next generation, don't be afraid to venture into the fisheries sector. Understand that we've learned a lot of lessons about sustainability. We've learned a lot of lessons about responsible stewardship, and there is opportunity. Because if I give you an example, in our region, we have more fish species that are not utilized than those that are utilized. So when I say there's opportunity, there is opportunity, but it's just that the narrative stifles us. So I want to say to the next generation, let's see if we can take a responsible approach to satisfying the issue of providing our people with safe and nutritious food, while at the same time sustaining livelihoods from the ocean. Thank you.
Thank you, Mitch. Hannah, Carl?
Carl, you want to go?
I think it would be, you know, I'm optimistic about our understandings. You know, it's just exemplar, you know, even of this event, that actually, you know, we're much more aware of what's going on, and trends like the initiatives, I suppose, in ocean literacy and the principles of ocean literacy in our communities. And the way that actually, yeah, tourists, despite their problems that Hannah, you really definitely pointed out there, that, you know, over tourism is a big problem, and let's hope that this year, past 18 months, has given us a pause to reflect. But having said that, tourism is one of the main interfaces for many of our communities and our citizens to understand the issues that our oceans are facing. So I suppose latching on to that real level of interest, and also engaging, you know, wonderful engagement with Indigenous knowledge now, and helping people on the planet understand how important our oceans are. You know, I think that we're at a time, hopefully, where this is on the agenda. So that's what I'm optimistic about, is that the knowledge is getting much better, and hopefully we can solve it in this interdisciplinary way together. And, you know, it's great to see this day has got so many people from so many different backgrounds. You've got artists and activists and academics and people working at the coalface. So it's all, those are the things that keep me optimistic.
Okay, thank you. Hannah?
Kia ora. I'm optimistic because my hoa aloha on Hokulea on their worldwide voyage left a wide wake for me to follow to World Oceans Day. I'm optimistic because Native sensibility, including aloha, has global relevancy. And aloha nui ka ko. Aloha nui to you all. From Hawaii nei.
Thank you so much. Well, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your strategies for moving forward. And thank you to the organizers for this particular panel on World Oceans Day. I think it's so important, and I really appreciate creating the space for us to be able to speak at this. And I will just leave with one final reflection that I've been reflecting on for a few days now. We have this courageous senator in Canada, and she's Cree, and she's a Cree woman, and Senator Mary Jane McCallum. And I just recently have met her, and she made a statement that has stayed with me, that makes me optimistic, and because we're trying so hard to ensure that there's livelihoods here for the next generation, for this generation, the next generation. And she kindly told us, or told me, she said, remember, your work is for the next 7 generations so that we can be remembered as good ancestors. And I've been thinking about that, and I've been trying to tell that in so many different ways, and she just simplified it for me. And it is so true. The work that we're doing is as challenging as it is, that we are laying a blueprint for the younger generation and generations to come of trying to understand how we got to climate change, how we got to these challenges, and they need guidance of how to face those challenges. And to me, that's what being a good ancestor is. So, Walalio, thank you so much. And it was great to see old friends and meet new ones. Thank you so much. Happy Oceans Day.
Okay.
Thanks, Sherry.
Thanks, Jerry.